familiar with forgetting things. So I've so frequently forgotten either my wallet, purse or keys that before I leave the house I go, wallet, purse, keys, wallet, purse, keys, wallet, purse, keys. I chant it to myself so that I make sure I've got each of those items in my bag. I at least also frequently forget events from my past. So someone might say to me, oh, do you remember going to see the film Finding Nemo? I don't really remember it, but I nod along and I pretend that I did, and I'm sure I did see the film, so I'm sure that no one's going to ever tell me that I was lying. And forgetting is one way then that we can be tricked by memory. But it's not the only way. Neither is it the way that I'm going to talk to you about today. Today I'm going to talk to you about cases in which we remember rather than forget. But what we remember is inaccurate in some way. Cases like these are cases in which memories are distorted. Here are some examples to get you to understand the sorts of cases I'm talking about. So Jimmy decides to bake a cake. So he writes himself a shopping list and heads out to the shop. Unfortunately though, he leaves for the shop without the list. Okay. Nonetheless, as he's an optimistic sort, he carries on and he thinks, I'm going to be able to work out which ingredients are on my list. He remains upbeat and he strides around the shop selecting items. Unfortunately though, when he gets home, he realises that he's got all the items on his list, but he's also bought butter when he really didn't need butter. Not such a sad ending to the story, but still an illustration of a memory distortion. Okay, when he remembers that he's got butter on his list when he's in the shop, he forms a memory. There's some kernel of truth to it. He did have bakery items on his list, but the memory's inaccurate because he didn't really have butter on the list. Okay, let's move on to another example. So Nadia is speaking to her mother on Skype. Okay, they're having a little chat, a little gossip, and Nadia's mother tells her that her sister's daughter started biting other children at nursery. Nadia takes a little bit of glee in this because she's ever so slightly mean-spirited towards her sister. But she's interesting and kind of reassured when her mother says she thinks this is just a phase. We're not to worry about their little child, it's fine, it's just a phase. And Nadia's mother says this because she says, well, Nadia's sister herself had bitten other children at nursery when she was a child. In fact, Nadia's sister had even bitten Nadia when she was small. Now, initially surprised by this, because Nadia is a few years older than her sister, and she would expect that if she'd been bitten by her sister, she'd remember it. She nonetheless starts to imagine what this would have been like. So Nadia thinks, oh, it would be really terrible if I'd been bitten as a child. It must have really hurt me. I'm surprised I'm not more traumatised. But after this conversation, Nadia doesn't think about the biting incident for a while until she speaks to her sister at a later point. Her sister says, oh, it's okay, yeah, my daughter stopped biting now. She's not biting at nursery, you don't need to worry. Nadia can't help herself at this point. She says, oh, you know, I was never worried because I remember you biting me. When I was small, but you were even smaller, you used to bite me. So I knew it was just a phase because it was just a phase when it happened to you. In this case, although Nadia doesn't initially remember having been bitten, after she imagines the scenario, she becomes convinced she can remember it. In fact, as it turns out, Nadia had been the biter. When she was small, she used to bite their older brother. Okay, so this is a false memory. And because it's a false memory, it's a distorted memory. It's inaccurate. There's some kernel of truth there. There was a biting incident. And she's been given some information that would be fitting with the memory being true, but it's not a true memory, it's a false memory. Now for the final example. Dan loves to talk about films, providing detailed examinations of the plots of films. This is all very interesting and entertaining. Apart from that, he discusses films with his friends when they've only just come out and his friends haven't had the chance yet to see them. So they find out all sorts of plot lines they didn't want to know. Okay, so because of this tendency, Dan becomes a little bit annoying to his friends. They decide to exact revenge on him. When he starts talking about the latest Bond film, they decide, well, okay, this is our chance to trick Dan. So they say that they all agreed that it was a great film, but they especially like the bit where the Ben Whishaw character used a jetpack Okay, this never happened, but they're planning to trick him, to get him to make a mistake, and they're really pleased later on when they hear their friend describing to his colleague how he's seen this Bond film, and he really likes it apart from the bit with the jetpack. Okay, so they're pleased, they've tricked him, and what's happened is that Dan has formed a distorted memory. He's formed a memory that has some kind of truth. He really did see the film. He really did form an opinion about the film, but there was no jetpack in it, so that wasn't true. Now, these cases of distorted memory are likely to be less familiar to you than cases of forgetting. So you might doubt, as a result of this, whether these sorts of things really occur or whether they occur very frequently if they do occur. However, psychological studies suggest that people systematically and predictably make errors of these sorts. And they suggest that errors of these sorts are part of the ordinary operation of human memory systems. So, for example, psychologists have undertaken studies using what has become known as a Deezer-Wodiger-McDermott paradigm, in which they presented participants with words and then asked them to remember the list of words. Okay, so you've been listening for a while, so I'm going to get you to participate if you want to. You don't have to, but okay, I'm going to show you a list of words now. Okay, now, speak to the person next to you, if you like, if they don't look too scary, and say all the words on the list. Okay, right. I've decided you've had enough time now. So, put your hand up if you thought the word bread was on the list. Okay, a couple of you. The rest of you really didn't? No? Okay, well, as a group you're doing better than the average then, it seems, because those of you who did think the word bread was on the list committed the sorts of error that very many people do when they're presented with a list of this sort. When people are presented with a list of this sort, very many of them falsely recall having been presented with certain words that they haven't been presented with. Words that are related to the items on the list but actually weren't on the list. Okay, so words that weren't given on the list to a participant, words like in this example, bread, were falsely reported to have been on the list 40% of the time. Okay, whilst this isn't the majority of the time, it's a very large number of incidents in which people have the sorts of memory distortion that was described in the shopping list example. In fact, what was found in studies is that items that were in the middle of the list were reported at roughly the same rate as the words that actually weren't on the list but were related in terms of the meaning to the words that were on the list. Okay. These studies have been replicated numerous times, and it's been found that this effect lasts over the course of 24 hours. So people asked 24 hours after they've been presented with the list, remember that words were on the list that actually weren't there. Okay, so examples like this, studies like this, suggest that cases like the shopping list example are likely to occur in real life. There's a very close parallel there. What happens in that case is that someone remembers that a word was on the list that was related to the words that actually were on the list. Well, what about the biter example then? In this case, triggered by the discussion with her mother, Nadia imagines her sister biting her. And as a result of imagining this, Nadia ends up believing that this event really did occur, that it really did happen to her. Psychological studies suggest that this sort of phenomenon happens quite frequently. Imagining that an event has occurred, for example, that you were left in a shop as a small child, increases the likelihood that you will remember that event as having occurred, the event having happened to you, and in fact increases the chances that you'll have a full-blown recall of the event. This phenomenon is called imagination inflation. So, for example, in one experiment, participants were asked to rate the likelihood that a certain event happened in their past, that they fell over in a particularly dramatic way. And then they were asked to imagine what it would have been like if they had fallen over in that dramatic way. Out of participants who initially said that it was really unlikely that that event had ever happened to them, after they'd imagined the event happening, 24% of them changed their mind and said that it was likely that the event did happen. So they went from saying it was really unlikely to it being really quite plausible. In fact, in a recent study, it's been found that people who've imagined an event that didn't happen are just as likely to remember that event happening as those people who are not asked to imagine, but shown a doctored video of them being there for the event. Okay. So these studies show that it's highly likely that cases like Nadia's will occur in real life. So finally, let's consider the film critic example. Is it likely that someone could end up believing that Ben Whishaw used a jetpack in the Bond film and it never really happened just because someone later told them that this did happen? Once again, psychological studies suggest that this sort of thing frequently occurs. Numerous studies show that information presented to an individual after an event often influences their memory of that event. And the memories fit with the information that's presented after the event rather than the details of the original event. Okay. For example, people might be shown a video clip of a car accident and then later be fed some information about that, suggesting that there was smashed glass at the incident. Later, when they're asked to recall the event, they'll remember that there was smashed glass when there really wasn't. And there's been a recent study that's especially relevant to the film clip example. An example where people were shown a movie, they were asked afterwards to describe what happened in the movie. Then, a few days later, they were asked again what happened in the movie, but this time they were fed information that was supposedly from other people who'd watched the movie with them. The information was false, but their recall, their description of the events that happened in the film reflects the false information that's given to them supposedly by their peers, rather than what happened in the film itself. So these psychological studies suggest that not only do we forget things, but we often remember things that didn't happen. We form memories that have some kernel of truth, but are nonetheless inaccurate. In response to these findings, we might become sceptical about the reliability of our memories. We might think that we can't rely on individual memories we form, or we can't rely on memory systems more generally. We might think that it's actually irrational to trust our memory systems once we understand that they work in this way. We might think that these studies simply show that we're tricked by memory. But now, I'm going to try and convince you that when we understand the explanations that are given of a phenomena, like the DRM illusion, that's the word list illusion, imagination, inflation, and the post-event information effect, that's the final one, it becomes clear that these errors are the result of our memory systems working in a way that increases rather than decreases the likelihood of us getting true beliefs overall. So rather than just being cases where we're tricked by memory, these are also cases where we demonstrate tricks of our memory. Okay, so I'm going to go through the examples again and show you how each of these cases can be interpreted as cases in which our memory systems are doing the sorts of things that are likely to lead to true beliefs. Okay, so the DRM case, this is the word list case. How does this show signs that our memory systems are working in such a way that we're likely to produce true beliefs? Well, there have been two explanations of this sort of phenomena. Okay, the first explanation is that when people falsely recall words, so when the few of you who admitted to falsely recalling the word bread, when you falsely recall words like this, what you're doing is displaying how your memory systems lead you to think of concepts that are related to the concepts that you're currently thinking about. Okay, so if you're thinking of items related to bread, then as a result of thinking of those items, you think of bread itself. Okay. Now, it's clear that this tendency could be really beneficial for people who want to make correct predictions about what they're likely to find in their environment. Okay, so I'm going to get you to do a bit of imagining now, again. So imagine you're in the jungle, okay? Can you see yourself there? You're surrounded by jungle-related items, trees and other things that you find in the jungle. As a result of seeing those items, you automatically think of other items that are found in a jungle, including snakes. So you think of snakes, okay? If there are snakes in the jungle, then it's going to be really beneficial for you to be prepared to see snakes, and so for you to see items related to the jungle and think of other related items such as snakes. This will enable you to predict what you're going to encounter in your environment. So if this illusion, the word list illusion, is just showing that we ordinarily make associations of this sort, that we think about concepts that are related to the concepts that we're currently encountering, like concepts like tree and leaves and the rest of this, we think of related items like snake, then it could well be a sign that our memory systems are working in a positive way. Okay? What's happening is we've got these memory systems that help us make predictions about our environment, and these manifest in this particular case in this way that we end up thinking that a word was on the list when it wasn't. Okay? So in this case, this particular tendency of our minds leads us to error, because we end up thinking that we remember seeing a word on the list when we really don't. When we really just think of it, we just think of the concept. But it can nonetheless be the result of a system that helps us to think well in very many situations. Right, so that's explanation one of the phenomenon, but it's not the only explanation out there on the market. There is another explanation, and this is that people only remember the gist information about the list. So rather than recalling specific details about the items on the list, what they do is they recall just the gist of the list, which in this case might well be something like items related to bread. Okay, so there could be various advantages to not remembering the details of a list, but rather remembering just the gist, like items related to bread. So you have the relevant information stored away to you. So you have the relevant information in this case, which is, there are bakery items out there that I need to be thinking about. But you don't take up that much space in your memory storage capacity. So that's one advantage. So you've got the relevant information there, these items are related to bread, but you're not taking up too much storage capacity in your memory. But there could be another advantage, which is that what you're doing then is you're recalling abstract information, right? You're not recalling just the details of each item on the list, you're recalling something more abstract than that. So these are bread-related items or bakery-related items, okay? So to understand how it might be an advantage to be recalling information in an abstract form rather than the details, I'm going to give you another example. Well, actually, I'm going to return to Jimmy and his list. Okay, so imagine that Jimmy starts wondering, is it really worth going outside in the rain to buy these items for the cake, right? There are two ways he could think about this. He could think, is it worth going out to buy eggs and flour and baking powder and sugar, okay? He might think individually none of those items are that interesting and worth him going out in the rain. But he might think in another way. He might think, is it worth going out and getting these items I need to bake my cake, right? Those are two different ways of thinking about it. If he ends up thinking about it in terms of the more abstract description, so he ends up thinking about, is it worth going out and buying the ingredients for my cake, then maybe he's more likely to make the correct decision in this case, which is of course to go out and buy those items and make that delicious cake. Okay. Unfortunately, thinking about the items in this way, in this abstract way, rather than remembering the details of each individual item on the list, leads him to make an error. He ends up buying butter. But in many cases, it could be that actually he's more likely to make the correct choice and form an accurate judgment about the situation if he remembers the situation in this way. Okay. So what about imagination inflation? This was illustrated by the Nadia example. How can this be considered to be the result of our memory systems operating in a way that makes us likely to get true beliefs rather than make errors overall? Well, some psychologists argue that memory actually exists to allow us to imagine what might happen in the future. They argue this in part because the areas of the brain that are responsible for remembering are also those that are responsible for imagination. At least there's some overlap. Okay, they're not precisely the same brain regions. So it's argued that memory is structured in such a way as to facilitate us being able to imagine the future. Okay, so what happens when we remember something is that we remember it in such a way that it will be useful for us to imagine something in the future. So we store away pieces of information, fragments of information, rather than whole episodes. For example, I might meet my sister in the park. As a result of this, I might store away pieces of information. I met someone in the park, I met my sister. Then at a later point, I might meet my brother at a bowling alley. So I store away, met my brother, met someone at the bowling alley. Then when I remember one of these events at a later point, I will recombine the pieces of information I've stored away to form an accurate picture of what has happened. I might do so correctly and remember meeting my sister at the park, or I might recombine the pieces of information in a way that is not correct and falsely recall meeting my brother in the park. However, I might be doing something a bit more interesting, and instead of thinking about meeting my brother or my sister, which probably wasn't great anyway, probably fine. Don't know, maybe meeting your brother or sister is amazing. Meeting mine's fine. Instead, today I am imagining meeting David Bowie in the park, okay? So, because the systems responsible for remembering are the same ones that are responsible for imagining, it's likely that the information about your imagination of this event, meeting David Bowie in the park, will be stored in the same systems as the information about the memories. So, when I remember an event at a later point, I might actually, because the systems that are storing the pieces of information about memory are the same ones that are storing information about what I've imagined, I might end up recombining these pieces of information such that I remember meeting David Bowie at a bowling alley. And you might think at this point, Kathy, what you've got to do is realise this is very unlikely and change your memory. But there might be a more plausible example where something similar would happen. You recombine pieces of information stored away in your imagination and stored in your memory in such a way that you form a false belief that something happened when you really only imagined it. Okay. So there are costs of memories working in this way, but there are also distinct advantages. It's incredibly important that we're able to imagine what might happen in the future so that we're able to make predictions and decisions. One good way to do this is to draw on past experience, but the future is never exactly like the past, so it's useful to be able to combine different pieces of information about the past in various different ways to imagine the future. And sometimes it's going to be useful to imagine scenarios that haven't happened in the past. So it's going to be useful to use your imaginations and your memories and combine these together to try and construct a picture of what might happen in the future. So if this is right, then the structure of memory and the way it's so closely tied in with imagination might be crucial and important to allowing us to make accurate predictions and decisions about the future. So, let's move on to the final example then. So, in this example, what we found was that you have an individual who is given information after an event, and they combine this information with the information that they have about the event itself, and they form a distorted memory of the event. How might this be viewed to be the result of a system operating in such a way that it's likely to increase our chances of getting true beliefs? Well, the argument goes as follows. As just noted, memory functions to support imagination and prediction of future events. A memory system will be most effective if it's able to incorporate the most recent evidence an individual has available to them. And sometimes information relevant to your understanding of a particular event doesn't become available to you until significantly after the event occurs. The post-event information effect, so this is where the individual takes the information given to them about the film and they incorporate it with the information that they had about the film. This illustrates that we are able to do this. We're able to update our memories with the most recent information that's been given to us. This capacity is likely to be especially useful when we're trying to make predictions about other people and their behaviours. Okay, so you might remember an episode in which you interacted with a person. So you talked with David Bowie, or you probably didn't in the past. So you have some information stored away about that episode. But later you might find out information about that past event or about that individual that it would be important and useful for you to be able to draw on and integrate with your information about that episode. So if you want a proper picture of that individual, their reliability, what they're like, then it's useful for you to not only draw on the information that you gain from meeting them, but also on any information that their friends or someone else that you meet might tell you about them at a later point. Okay. So what happens, it seems, is that people's memory systems work in such a way that they take the information about the past event and the new information, they integrate them together, and they recall events in a false way, but in a way that reflects the sum total of the information available to the individual at the point where they're doing the remembering. So we have the most up-to-date impression of individuals to use to make predictions and explanations about them. Now, errors follow in terms of our the accuracy of our impressions of events that have happened in the past, because our impressions of those events are changed in light of information we obtain after the event. But nonetheless, it seems as if these errors are just a sign of the operation of a system that's quite dynamic, that actually enables us to make the best use of all of the information available to us, including information that's gained after an event. Okay. So, conclusion. When we notice memory distortions, we shouldn't automatically conclude that they're signs of irrationality, and we shouldn't immediately assume that we should adopt a sceptical position towards all of our memories and worry that they're very reliable. Memory distortions are signs that we're tricked by our memories, but they're also signs of tricks of our memories. Signs that our memory systems are operating in ways that are likely to improve our chances of getting true beliefs overall. Thank you.